Hello. So in this episode of Writing Notes, I'm going to talk to you about the difference between having an education and being educated. Now, this picks up from some of the ideas that I talked about in one of my earliest videos about how to succeed in university. But here I'm taking specifically some ideas from Erich Fromm's book, To Have or to Be. So Fromm is, or was, I don't know if he's still alive actually. So Fromm was a psychologist and a sociologist, and what he talks about in To Have or to Be is two different modes of existing. One oriented around possessions, which becomes a superficial mode of existing in the world, and it leads to a tremendous amount of anxiety because the having subject, the person who defines their identity through their possessions, is constantly striving to gain more possessions and jealously guarding the possessions that they have, which leads to a tremendous amount of anxiety, distrust, and so on and so on. On the other hand, the being mode of existence is oriented around experience and is oriented around developing the inner core of the person. In some places, this is a bit new agey for my taste, and so in that sense, I'm in some cases not a huge fan of Fromm's arguments. But when he talks about the process of learning, I think he actually presents this in a really, really good way in laying out two different approaches to gaining an education. So I want to read you Fromm's section on learning. It's a bit lengthy, but I think it's worth hearing in its entirety. So, he says, students in the having mode of existence will listen to a lecture, hearing the words and understanding their logical structure and their meaning, and, as best they can, will write down every word in their loose-leaf notebooks so that later on they can memorize their notes and thus pass an examination. But the content does not become part of their own individual system of thought, enriching and widening it. Instead, they transform the words they hear into fixed clusters of thought, or whole theories, which they store up. The students and the content of the lectures remain strangers to each other, except that each student has become the owner of a collection of statements made by somebody else, who had either created them or taken them over from another resource. Students in the having mode have but one aim: to hold on to what they learned, either by entrusting it firmly to their memories or by carefully guarding their notes. They do not have to produce or create anything new, or something new, sorry. In fact, the having type individuals feel rather disturbed by new thoughts or ideas about a subject because the new puts into question the fixed sum of information they have. Indeed, to one for whom having is the main form of relatedness to the world, ideas that cannot easily be pinned down or penned down are frightening, like everything else that grows and changes and thus is not controllable. The process of learning has an entirely different quality for students in the being mode of relatedness to the world. To begin with, they do not go to the course of lectures, even to the first one in a course, as tabula rasa. For those of you not familiar with that phrase, it means a blank slate. So it's the idea that we begin life, or we begin a particular experience with no background, no experience that we can bring to the table. They've thought beforehand about the problems the lectures will be dealing with, and have in mind certain questions and problems of their own. They've been occupied with the topic and it interests them. Instead of being passive receptacles of words and ideas, they listen, they hear, and most important, they receive and they respond in an active, productive way. What they listen to stimulates their own thinking processes. New questions, new ideas, new perspectives arise in their mind. Their listening is an alive process. They listen with interest, hear what the lecturer says, and spontaneously come to life in response to what they hear. They do not simply acquire knowledge that they can take home and memorize. Each student has been affected and changed. Each is different after the lecture than he or she was before it. Of course, this mode of learning can prevail only if the lecture offers stimulating material. Empty talk cannot be responded to in the being mode, and in such circumstances, students in the being mode find it best not to listen at all, but to concentrate on their own thought processes. So we get at the end there the responsibility of the instructor to make things interesting, which is, of course, a subject of debate among educators about whether or not we are meant to be entertainers or whether or not we are meant merely to provide information, or in what balance we're supposed to do those two things. Obviously, the more excited that we as instructors are about our subjects, the more likely students are to become excited about it. But from your position as a student, from your position as someone coming into a classroom, what Fromm's theory suggests here is that there's a lot that you can do to forward your own educational process, to take ownership of your own education in a positive way, as opposed to in a proprietary way. So what he would argue, and I think this is absolutely right, is that the notion of acquiring an education can mean two different things. It can mean, on the one hand, I've gained knowledge that I now own, and I can deploy that knowledge specifically for things like exams. But it can also mean I've internalized knowledge. I've, within myself, ingrained that information as part of a larger world picture. And this, for Fromm, and I would agree with this as well, is the more substantial, the more effective means of gaining an education. That we approach information, we approach knowledge, we approach reading, we approach whatever it is, critically and inquisitively. We ask, why is that the case? How does this compare to other information that I have? What's the basis for this argument? How does this compare to other arguments about the same subject? How does this fit with other pieces of information from other disciplines, etc., etc.? So I give you, this video is in fact a real world example of this kind of seeking and finding connectedness, because Fromm is not an education theorist. He is a psychologist and a sociologist and a political theorist, but his work gives us insight into the process of learning, which is really quite useful. And so we can bring to other courses that aren't related to Fromm's disciplines these particular ideas about critically internalizing information as a mode of being-based learning, a way of being educated rather than just having an education.